when it reaches equilibrium, that's its natural state. But disequilibrium, that requires some order. So let's just say this as our first principle. If any work is going to be done by a physical system, you're going to need some disequilibrium. And if you have some disequilibrium, you're going to have some order. So think of it this way. Get the disequilibrium out of there. And just simply say, if you're going to have work in a physical system, produced by a physical system, you have to have order of that in that system. Everybody sort of okay? So you're going to have to order the parts in a very special way. Number two, every time work is done by a physical system, a little bit of that order is lost for purely statistical, probabilistic reasons. Okay? Why? Because order is far more improbable than disorder. Disorder is really easy to achieve. Order is very difficult to achieve. If I have a pool table with a nice triangularly configured group of pool balls, and I shoot the cue ball at those triangularly configured pool balls and they scatter all over the table randomly, I don't think anything of this. I know that it moved from order to disorder, and it doesn't boggle my mind. But if I shot the cue ball at the 10 ball, which hit the 8 ball, which hit the 7 ball, which then and it went back together in a triangular configuration and spit the cue ball out at the end, I go, wow, that was highly improbable. And so it would be. Because we all know order is far more improbable than disorder. Now, when you do work with a physical system, I'm going to be very crude here and not use technical terms, you got to kind of jumble the system. You got to shake it up. And when you shake it up, as you might expect, what happens? The system is going to do what? It's going to move toward greater disorder. And of course, if it moves toward greater disorder, then what's going to happen? Is it going to go back to order again? No. It's going to stay disordered. Because moving back to order would be highly, highly improbable. That's why when you make a photocopy, right? When you make a photocopy, have you ever noticed that the next generation, it's more faded? Every time your cell multiplies, you know what I'm saying? Those genetic constituents, they just don't go back together as well as they did when you had little baby cells. They're old cells. They're copies of copies of copies. You know, it begins to lose its order. It begins to lose the precision of its order. And as it does so, the physical system runs down. It can't do as much work because we need order in order for work to be done. You hanging in there? Now, if this has to go on and it's irreversible, and physicists really do believe that there are no, perpetual motion machines, they really do believe that every physical system will get to a greater degree of disorder, and when it gets to a greater degree of disorder, it's going to be able to do less work, and so every physical system is going to run down. Now let's suppose that in the standard Big Bang model, the universe is treated as an isolated physical system. So you don't have any other systems on the outside putting order back into the universe. With me? If the universe really were an isolated physical system, and the universe has been burning stars, forming planets, work, right? Physicists to think about it, okay? And all this has been going on for an infinite amount of time. But there was only a finite amount of order in the universe to begin with. What would we expect the universe to be able to do today? Nothing. It couldn't do any work. It'd be a dead universe. because every single bit of its order would have decayed into disorder, and once it decayed into disorder, it would be completely run down. The temperature in the universe would be everywhere the same at just a fraction of a microdegree above absolute 0 Kelvin. Dead. Unable to do anything. But in point of fact, the inconvenient fact is that our universe has a very low entropy. And because it has a low entropy, it can still burn stars. There's going to be parts of our universe that are dark and cold, and parts of our universe that are hot. And planets are being formed, and work's being done, and physicists are still thinking about it. Far from a dead universe. Point of fact, it looks like our universe hasn't been around for an infinite amount of time at all. Some people used to think that an oscillating universe might be able to explain this, that if the universe went into a contraction and then moved toward a singularity, that somehow we would get a restart with low entropy. But in point of fact, that doesn't happen. When the universe collapses, we know from Jacob Bekenstein's equations with respect to black holes that as the universe begins to approach a singularity and a collapse, the big crunch, the entropy goes up by a factor of 10 to the 80th. Then when it gets close to the singularity, you know what happens? It actually can turn into a completely dead universe in one collapse. That's what Fischler has discovered. And so, of course, gee, that's a problem. Well, maybe Sean Carroll's got the multiverse, which he thinks can get out of the entropy problem. But there are a lot of physicists who don't think that'll work at all. That in point of fact that the multiverse is also going to have to be dependent upon entropy, because entropy is a statistical law. It's not just a physical law. For all intents and purposes, it still looks like a pretty good argument that the universe has not been around for an infinite amount of time. It had a beginning. So now we have two completely different data sets converging on a single conclusion. That the universe, indeed physical reality itself, because remember, entropy, just like the Board of Lincoln and Guth proof, entropy is vastly applicable. There's only one condition, right? The physics of the universe doesn't matter so long as the average Hubble expansion is greater than 0. And same thing with respect to entropy. Basically, order is far more improbable than disorder, and therefore everything is going to move toward the direction of improbability on the basis of statistics alone, which would apply to just about any physical configuration. Well then, perhaps there was a beginning. Perhaps it's probative and reasonable and responsible to believe this. In order to get out of it, you really do have to invent some really interesting universes, like big rips and all kinds of other things, where you have to have more faith not to believe in God than to believe in God. Back to the same prospect. But I'll leave it at that. Is there a third kind of evidence that we can sort of utilize? And the answer is yeah, there is. There's the fine-tuning of universal constants and conditions. And this is a big problem. Make no mistake about it. Even Stephen Hawking admits it, right? In the Grand Design, all of Chapter 6 is devoted to these fine-tuning constants. He believes that it's explicable in terms of the multiverse, and we're going to take a look at that in just a moment. But right now, let's just take a look at the fine-tuning or anthropic coincidences themselves. Are you still hanging in there a little bit? Have I lost you completely? Okay, 15? Okay. All right. Just some examples. Low entropy is based on higher order. Higher order is improbable. Do you know what the odds are of having low entropy at the Big Bang are? Do you know the odds of having low entropy at the Big Bang? Roger Penrose did this calculation. It's 10 raised to the 10 raised to the 123 to 1 against. Now that's a double exponent. Now if you were to reduce it to a single exponent, that would be a 10, and in the exponent a 1 with 123 zeros after it. So the exponent is a trillion, 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 trillion. Now, if you reduce that to a single number and every zero were 10-point type, basically our solar system could not hold that number. It's the same odds basically as a monkey typing Shakespeare by random tapping of the keys through pure chance. You walk into the room and sternly order the monkey, type Shakespeare. The monkey says happily. Actually, he doesn't say anything because he doesn't know any English. So he goes and he begins randomly tapping on the keys. You come back a couple weeks later, there's Macbeth and Richard III. And you see, you look at it and you go, wow, that was highly improbable. And so it would be, right? You might even think that someone with a very good knowledge of Shakespeare helped the monkey. The monkey's looking very self-satisfied, smoking a cigarette, and you think to yourself, really? Well, that's the odds of low entropy at our universe at the Big Bang. This is a big problem. You just can't shove it off. You just can't say, oh, there's some explanation. Because it happened at the Big Bang. A boundary condition to natural causation as we know it. You're going to have to invent something really interesting to explain this at the Big Bang. We're not talking about right now, God in the gaps arguments. We're not talking about intelligent design from a biological system that had pre-existent natural causes. We're talking about a boundary condition to natural causation. And that's very interesting. Very interesting indeed. But there are other kinds of fine-tuning paradoxes as well. We have things called constants in our universe. There are about 20 of them. There may be more that we haven't discovered. But essentially, you know some of them. The speed of light constant, we just saw one, right? 186,200 miles per second, the highest velocity attainable by the universe, right? The invariant reference frame of light and energy. Okay. Planck's constant, many of you who've studied light wave frequencies and energetic emission are familiar with the Planck constant. We have, remember our four universal forces, right? The gravitational force, the strong nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, and the weak force. Every one of them has a constant. Maybe you took Physics 101 and you remember the gravitational constant, the capital G there, that governs practically half the equations of physics. Okay? Or not half, but good 25% anyway. Okay? You certainly have the strong nuclear force coupling constant. You have the weak force constant that goes with the weak force. And the electromagnetic force has three constants. The mass of the proton, the mass of the electron, and the electromagnetic charge. So a constant is an invariant number, everybody. It's a number that stays the same. But the interesting thing about these numbers, and these numbers sometimes can represent minimums, sometimes they represent maximums, sometimes they represent ratios, sometimes they represent parameters, sometimes they represent, right, the magnitude of a force, etc. But whatever it is, these numbers control not only all the equations of physics, these numbers therefore control all of the laws of nature. Now drill this in, because this is the most important thought about it. Those numbers could have been anything at the Big Bang, just like the entropy of our universe, right? So in other words, every possibility is equal at the Big Bang. Every number is equal at the Big Bang. So you could have just as easily have had a number other than the ones that we have. But here's the rub. If you don't have the numbers we have, then life would be impossible in our universe. Within a very, very narrow window of opportunity. Let me explain. If you varied the gravitational constant or the weak force constant by only 1 part in 10 to the 50th. That's a very small fraction. A decimal point, 49 zeros and a 1. That's a very small fraction. If you vary either one of those two constants by 1 part in 10 to the 50th, higher or lower than their values, then either the universe would have been continuously exploding in its expansion, which would be very bad for life forms, incinerate everything bad, or the universe would have collapsed into a black hole, crushing the mass of the universe, right? The mass density of the universe almost, approaching infinity almost, right? Into 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, crushing everything, which is very bad for life forms. You mean we averted absolute disaster? By 1 part in 10 to the 50th, higher, or a margin of 1 part in 10 to the 50th, higher or lower from the constant values we have for the gravitational and weak force constants at the Big Bang when any other value was equally possible? Are you kidding me? Do you know the odds of hitting that puppy straight on? This is very, very, very improbable. I'll give you another couple. You get the point. If you varied the gravitational constant, the mass of the proton, the mass of the electron, or the electromagnetic constant, so any one of those 4 constants, higher or lower, by a factor of 1 part in 10 to the 39. So that's a decimal point, 38 zeros and a 1. Very small fraction. Any one of those constants. Do you realize that every star in our universe would not be like our nice star or other very nice stars? They would be either blue giants or red dwarfs. If you thought supernovas were bad, blue giants are very bad. If every star in our universe were a blue giant, right? I mean, this is called convective instability squared, right? And so basically, if every star in the universe would be a blue giant, everything would be incinerated. It's very bad for life forms. Alternatively, if every star in our universe were a red dwarf, everything would freeze because there wouldn't be enough energy generated to do anything, let alone allow a life form to develop. Frozen. Just saying. You know the odds of averting? I mean, we are incredibly close to the barrier of convective instability on either side, and all the stars in our universe just happen to be exactly what they need to be, and those 4 constants just are within 1 part in 10 to the 39 to avoid convective instability. Do you think this really happened by pure chance? I don't know. We'll talk about it in a moment. Number 3. If you varied that strong nuclear force constant just by 2% higher, there would be absolutely no hydrogen in our universe. That's very bad, because then there's no nuclear fuel. That's bad for warmth. And more than that, you'd have no water, which is generally bad for life. Alternatively, if you lowered that strong nuclear force coupling constant by 2%, you would have no element on that periodic table heavier than hydrogen. Exceedingly bad for life forms, because you not only wouldn't have any carbon, you wouldn't have any iron or anything other than hydrogen to work with. Just saying. Lucked out again. Now, there are a lot of, if you want tons of examples, just read chapter 2 of this book. But the key thing we want to recognize is this is highly improbable. Life, and we're not talking about a God in the gaps. We're not talking about intelligent design, which can make recourse to a prior natural explanation. We're talking about the Big Bang. The constants are set at the Big Bang. Entropy is set at the Big Bang. There's no appeal to a prior natural causative act. It's the lottery, literally the lottery of what constant are you going to get when you have a mass that's approximately, by the way, visible matter in our universe is about approximately 10 to the 55 kilograms, more or less. You get that amount of mass, you better have those constants dead on what they are. And they are dead on what they are. for life. And it's really, really, really improbable. Now you say, okay, well, I'm going to be a little looser. I just want to come to a few other conclusions. I'll do some quick things on near-death experiences, and then we can go to your questions. But I want to get to this point. There's really only two tenable explanations. The natural explanation is the multiverse theory. Okay? So, why a multiverse? Because a multiverse generates a new bubble universe with new constants. By the way, a multiverse is completely hypothetical. Okay? But according to the theory, you can get, right, new constants in every bubble universe, right? So they don't have to resemble our universe. They're altogether new. So, in a multiverse, you could have a trillion. You could have 10 to the 10 to the 123 universes to explain our entropy. But you have to keep going. You're going to have to postulate probably another 10 to the 10 to the 125 additional universes to get the constants to be the same. So by the time you're done, you're going to have to postulate a lot of bubble universes. So basically you're going to have to, it's not just trillions and trillions, it's like monkeys typing Shakespeare, except now typing the whole English language corpus, right? Okay. So by pure chance type of thing. So we're dealing with big numbers of universes, but still possible. That's one thing. And, right, every multiverse is going to have a beginning, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't been around for a trillion years, popping out trillion bubble universes that'll all get... Now, Paul Davies says, well, there's a bit of a problem. He says, you know, it's a violation of Occam's razor. It's like bringing excess baggage to cosmic extremes. To have to postulate, literally, trillions upon trillions of universes simply to explain one, our own. But nevertheless, it is a theory. It is a possibility. That is one possibility. Okay? Now we can go to number two. God. Basically an intelligent designer. Now, of course, you bring that up, and immediately the Dawkins response is going to come. Well, wait a minute. Every designer has to be more complex than what it designs. Therefore, since complexity is more improbable, right? The more complex, the more improbable. Every designer will always have to be more improbable than what it designs. That's simply not true. Every designer does not have to be more complex. As a matter of fact, frankly, if you want to know the argument, ask me because I can explain it in 5 easy steps. All logical. And basically, an uncaused cause is going to have to be a pure act of existing through itself. And a pure act of existing through itself cannot have any restriction in it at all. Because if it had a restriction in it, that restriction would have to be different from the pure act of existing through itself, in which case it would have to be caused. Therefore, you'd have to have something caused within an uncaused cause, which is bad. It's a contradiction. So the key thing is, well, wait a minute. If you have an unrestricted pure act of existing through itself, and it has no restrictions in it, no restrictions to it, then it can't have any parts. And if it doesn't have any parts, it's absolutely simple, and it's the absence of complexity. Dawkins, you're absolutely wrong. It's the opposite way around, and we've known that since the time of Aristotle. Now, if that is honestly the case, I'm sorry I just can't seem to get this thing right, but I'm going to try anyway. If that is absolutely the case, then think about Dawkins' second premise, that the more complex, the more improbable. Imagine now the absence of complexity. That must be the most probable thing of all. Thank you, Richard. You proved my point. God is the most probable being of all. An absolutely simple being would have to be the most probable being of all. Now, proceeding from that, we better take a look at the multiverse and maybe open it up to your questions. If you want to know about near-death experiences, I'm happy to do it in the Q&A. The key thing, though, is that the only problem with the multiverse, that it violates Occam's razor? No. The problem is every known multiverse hypothesis has fine-tuning itself in its initial conditions and parameters. What Albigetti and Life have discovered is that you can't just have arbitrary multiverses where bubble universes are popping out, because those bubble universes, they're going to have their gravitational effects. And those bubble universes then will begin to collide with each other and interfere with each other. And then, of course, if they collide or interfere with each other, why, that's just like, these bubble universes the whole space-time geometry of them is shaking like a jello. And that's very bad for life forms. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have a slow roll of bubble universes. And with the slow roll of bubble universes, you're going to also have what I would call a point at which the bubble universe is going to have a lot of order in it, a lot of fine-tuning in it to guarantee the slow roll of the bubble universes instead of the sporadic functioning of the bubble universes, which means that if you have fine-tuning in the multiverse, all you've done is move the fine-tuning paradox back one step. This hasn't solved anything. What caused the order and the fine-tuning of the multiverse to get the slow roll or whatever it may be? That is the paradox with which we, kind of sit with now. So I want to get to the Q&A. So what I'd like to do is just simply sum up by saying the following. If you piece together the evidence for fine-tuning by considering that the multiverse has itself fine-tuning, and you find that an absolutely simple reality, like a designer, is more probative, probable, reasonable, and responsible than trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of universes in a multiverse in order to get a naturalistic explanation, you would be well within your rights to do that, because it may in fact be more probative, more probable, more reasonable, and more responsible, since every designer, an uncaused cause designer, would have to be absolutely simple and the most probable being of all. If you put that together with the evidence for a beginning from entropy, and you put it together with the evidence for a beginning from the space-time geometry proofs, particularly the single-condition space-time geometry proof of Bordova, Lenkin, and Guth in 2003, you have an interesting thing that John Henry Newman called an informal inference. Essentially, what you have is all kinds of independent data sources, all converging on a single conclusion. There's an intelligent creator, an intelligent, transcendent creator, outside of universal or multiversal space-time asymmetry. And that creator, that intelligent creator, may well be imminent, present to us in this room right now. But whatever it is, and whatever we conclude, I think it is very reasonable and responsible. We're getting to the point today where it takes more faith not to believe in the evidence than to believe in it. The systems created to get out of the evidence are so extravagant, anything but eloquent. Just multiplication of multiplications of complexity in order to explain it. For all intents and purposes, we may be in a very good position to say, why, theists aren't morons. Theists are probative, reasonable, and responsible, because faith and science really don't conflict. Faith and science are complementary. They lead right into the mind and possibly the heart of God. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. I'd be happy to take your questions, but please feel free to leave. I know you guys are just also, you may need to get a well-earned break.
Yeah, if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you, and then you can use the mic. And please limit it to a question rather than comments if you can, just so that we can respect the time. Thanks. Yeah. And if you have to leave, go ahead and leave quietly. People are doing that already.
Yes, I would like to hear your thoughts on near-death experiences and, how that fits with all of your scientific knowledge.
Oh, okay, very good. I do think near-death experiences, of course, are not cosmological evidence, but they're rather interesting things. There are just 4 studies that I'd like to call your attention to in peer-reviewed journals, because anytime you bring up near-death experiences, I do it with great trepidation, because a lot of people use anecdotal information and they use it for their own agendas and things of that nature. So be very careful with them. But here's a couple of ones. Dr. Pim van Lommel and his team, they wrote a 2001 study that was published in The Lancet, which is Great Britain's #1 medical journal. And that 2001 study, oh, by the way, it's you can get it right off our website. The whole thing is right there. You can click on it. And there's interviews with Dr. Pim van Lommel as well. Anyway, this was an 11-year study. It involved multiple hospitals. They correlated people who had near-death experiences versus those who did not, who experienced clinical death, and at 2 years and at 8 years. And they have very, very good control groups and corroborative data. So I think that's a good study. There's a second one done by Dr. Melvin Morse. They were published in 2 journals, JAMA journals. And you can get those citations. And your bibliography, the studies are there. So you can just get those 2 JAMA articles right on your select bibliography there. And then Dr. Kenneth Ring's study on the near-death experiences of the blind, very, very important theory. And then finally, Dr. Janice Holden also kind of did a comprehensive analysis of veridical data from 39 different studies, and she gave some impressive evidence. So maybe I'll just begin with that. What's supposedly happening? And the reason I think this is important is because it does change the whole notion of consciousness. Does consciousness originate with the brain? That is what we've always assumed, and so forth. But boy, there might be some evidence that consciousness may have some origin other than the brain, and that the brain is closely or deeply paralleled with consciousness independently of it. But there seems to be some change that may be required in the way we view human beings, particularly our consciousness. During a near-death experience, what is purported to happen is that a transphysical entity, some transphysical component or dimension of a person leaves that body. When they leave that body, they are able to see without eyes, hear without ears, remember without a brain, and recall without a brain. The people know who they are. They have their own self-identity intact. Their memories are clear and lucid, and they're able to memorize things that are happening to them during the near-death experience. So it's a very interesting kind of a thing. But are they conscious? Yes, they're conscious. Seeing, hearing, conscious, remembering, recalling memories, self-identity intact, etc. It's not necessarily, this transphysical entity is not subject to physical laws. It can go right through hospital walls. It can go through walls of the waiting room. It's not limited in any way, seemingly, And so, basically, when you start making preposterous things like this and you start getting really on the edge of physical theories, people start getting really nervous, and so do I. But I'm just going to keep explaining, because I think there's some veridical data that we really have to consider. And it's shaken me out of my physicalism. It really has. And I'll just say this. Veridical data is something which is highly unusual. You know what I'm saying? So it's not something that's typical in a resuscitation procedure. So it'd be some event that somebody sees while they are clinically dead that can be corroborated after the fact by an independent researcher. So something unusual, something that would not have been expected, that's corroborated after the fact, okay? by an independent researcher, okay, or researchers, okay? Now, Janice Holden did a study of these. In 37 different studies, or 39 different studies, she found that 55% didn't fit that definition of veridical. So basically, either the thing was not unusual enough, an independent researcher was not able to corroborate it after the fact, so 55% of the data in those 30, she just threw it out of those 39 studies. But of the remaining 45%, only 8% had any inaccuracy at all. Even a slight inaccuracy. Only 8%. The remaining, right, 37%, had no inaccuracy at all. An unusual event, right? So a woman dies. She goes outside the walls of the hospital, and she sees a sneaker on the ledge. And she reports, you know, there's a sneaker out there on the third floor ledge. And I just thought I might tell you, too, that the baby toe area is really worn out. And by the way, the shoelace is stuck underneath the heel. So this Kim Clark, researcher who works for Dr. Melvin Morse, crawls out there on the ledge of the third floor. There it is. Exactly, precisely as stated. That's veridical. I mean, who could have predicted this? Right? Mr. So-and-so, we lost your dentures. Oh, you didn't lose my dentures. I saw you take them out of my mouth, and then the nurse who took them out of my mouth threw them into this drawer of this compartment there, and it's underneath a machine that looks just like this. If you go down to the operating room, you're going to find my dentures. Sure enough, there they are. Again and again, you know, the guy passes through the waiting room, and there is his sister insulting him in front of a business colleague. And of course, you could say, well, was she really doing it? Yes. Somebody was wearing mismatched plaids. You know, people were coming in and out with clothes that looked like this, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, like 37%, no inaccuracy at all. Just saying. Gives you thought. Number two, 80% of blind people see clear and precise visual perceptions when they're clinically dead. In the Kenneth Ring study, essentially, the 20% that didn't see during their clinical death just couldn't, some of them couldn't remember seeing, and some of them said, I just don't know what you mean by that term. So basically, the 80% who did see reported things that they'd never seen in their entire lives. Most of the patients in that Ring study were blind from birth. I don't know how you explain that. I don't know how you explain that. Dr. Melvin Morse took a modified polygraph machine, measured the death anxiety of kids who had a near-death experience when they underwent clinical death versus did not have a near-death experience when they went under. So there's a control group there. The ones who had a near-death experience, right, their death anxiety goes down to about 0. The ones who did not, their death anxiety went up above the norm, above the average population. Almost 100% of the time. Very difficult to explain. Something is not happening outside of the cell. All kinds of things, you can also go over to another domain. And when you go over to that other domain, you frequently meet deceased relatives. And those deceased relatives can tell you things about your family you never knew. And you can come back and say, Mom, I met Aunt so-and-so. And she said, you know, and of course little kids are great, you know. She said that you had a secret name for your teddy bear. Oh yeah, what was it? Cuddle Squared. No, that would be my name for a teddy bear. You get the point. The point, of course, is pretty clearly there's some really interesting circumstantial evidence there, which is really challenging our physicalist assumptions about consciousness. And, you know, perhaps there's some quantum explanation for this, but as of the current moment, it seems as if consciousness can remain intact independently of the body and independently of the brain, suggesting that there could be survival of human consciousness after bodily death. So that's a brief summary. But it's interesting because, right, you know, it challenges our physicalist assumptions, and maybe we should be challenged. You know, the evidence is really there. It needs more testing. We can't be definitive, but, you know, Dr. Eben Alexander, the Harvard researcher, right, has that book, Proof of Heaven, and he has an interesting defense of his view of consciousness after his book. In November of 2012, he wrote a kind of a medical defense of his beliefs, less popular than the Proof of Heaven book. So you might take a look at that. But that just kind of adds to the whole area of there's more to this reality of ours and more to this universal reality than can be explained by the universe or physics itself. But we're going to have to start looking for interesting paradigms. And by the way, faith is very commensurate with those trans-physical realities and those non-physicalist assumptions. So it's very interesting. Other questions?
With that, talking about a non-physical aspect to consciousness, how would we rectify that with the host of neuroscience evidence, particularly maybe looking at lesion studies where lesions to a whole variety of areas can cause very specific deficits in behavior and conscious experience, and that different brain areas cause very, very distinct deficits that have been mapped out?
Yeah, I mean, for all intents and purposes, I think the physicalist challenge is not going to be so much from, brain deficits, because essentially, in order for this transphysical consciousness to work through the body, it's going to have to be mediated by the brain. So if you have a brain deficit, you may have, and that's why you just have to treat some of these, mentally challenged kids with a great deal of respect, because there may be something there that we just cannot connect with, because that brain is not allowing that child to speak through his or her body. So in other words, it's like verbal production. You know, when I used to work with Alzheimer's patients, and you know how Alzheimer's patients, they take a long time for verbal production, right? So you'd say to Mr. So-and-so, how are you doing today? And then you would be on question number 55, and he would say, fine. He's back on 1, right? Now, the same thing happens, that sometimes people are processing data, and the verbal production is exceedingly limited, or the processing components are exceedingly limited. So actually, when you have brain deficits, it doesn't disprove another source of consciousness. What it proves is that that consciousness cannot be mediated through the body properly, because there's such a close parallelism or deep parallelism between a transphysical consciousness and a physical one. That would be my theory. So that's how I'd answer the question, but go ahead and follow up if you wish. Oh.
Do you believe in possession by the devil, and how do you explain that in terms of possession of innocent children? That's certainly a belief in many cultures, and apparently we had one of those dramatic possessions in St. Louis, and I think one of the Jesuits exercised exorcism here.
Well, there's clearly demons. Jesus believed there were clearly demons. I certainly believe that there are spirits and entities that are don't have our best interests in mind, and are constantly tempting us, and which we have to struggle with. The whole idea of demonic possession is a more difficult thing to reconcile. As far as I know, every single case of possession was always preceded by somebody doing something with the occult. So, how does this happen? Well, people start pulling out Ouija boards. People start doing things. They start getting into occult things, including the case in St. Louis. This is not an innocent case, right? I know how William Peter Blatty presented it in The Exorcist, as, boom, just out of the blue, Reagan gets possessed. But in point of fact, most of those possession cases are accompanied by somebody playing with or seriously devoted to the occult. Secondly, with respect to, the occurrence of possession, is that a very usual thing? In my view, no, it is not. I think poltergeists are. I think there are demonic possessions of houses, things of that nature. Yes, those things really do happen. But real demonic possessions of a person are pretty rare indeed. And of course, when they do happen, and they do seem to happen, they happen because somebody has been calling upon the devil. And you say, well, why would God allow an innocent child to be possessed? Generally, I'm not sure if I can answer that question, but Jesus basically indicated that in the case of, the 2 cases of the boys, who were possessed in the Scriptures, that those possessions would not lead to any kind of damnation of a child, obviously, because they're not responsible for what happened. But Jesus does say that those devils can be cast out. So, but why it's allowed to occur, I don't know. It's one of the most vexing questions around, but do I think it happens? Rarely with young children, more with adolescents, as in the case in St. Louis, which is seemingly a pretty substantial case. I wish I could answer it more thoroughly for you. No, I don't think you can, because, there's so many different physical explanations for it. I do think, too, there's paranormal experiences that do not have to be attributable to an evil spirit, right? And so, all these kinds of things, I don't think it really can be proven, no. But I do think, if Jesus certainly seemed to think that there were demons, and I don't think that was attributable to the fact that, he had an anachronistic view of physiology. I think he thought there were really spirits out there who were pretty bad spirits. But, there it is. It's not provable, though. I really don't think so.
I was wondering if you'd comment on the probability of what I'm going to call the Men in Black question. Like at the end of the movie Men in Black, they zoom out and the whole, they just show our galaxy, but our whole universe is within this little marble that aliens are playing with. So what's the probability that we're some experiment from some other larger scale universe?
Yeah. Oh, no, there have been a couple of people who've postulated these things, and the way I would look at it is, okay, if there's an alien universe and we're all contained in it, kind of like a philosopher by the name of Berkeley on steroids, right? If you really had something like that, you'd still have to have those aliens would still not be uncaused causes, because it can only have one of them. So ultimately, what you're going to have is those aliens are going to have a cause. And of course, then you could say, well, maybe that cause is there were other aliens outside of those aliens, and maybe could you have an infinite regression of aliens looking at aliens, looking at aliens, looking at us? And of course, you can't have an infinite regression of them, because eventually they're all going to have to resolve to an uncaused cause at some point. So my result, I'd have to go to metaphysics, because you're so deeply into metaphysics the moment you kind of speculate along those lines, right? Eventually, metaphysics will dictate you're going to have an uncaused cause at the end of the sequence. And if you do, the uncaused cause, as I said before, has to be unrestricted. If unrestricted, it has to be one, right? Because you're going to have a restriction, right? If you're going to have 2 or more of anything, you're going to have a difference between the one and the other, right? So one's going to have something, be something, or be someone where that the other one is not. But if the other one is not somewhere, not that something, or doesn't have that something, it's finite, it's restricted. But an uncaused cause has to be unrestricted. Therefore, you can only have one of them. So it's not going to be the aliens of the aliens of the aliens of the aliens. You're just going to have one unique, unrestricted, pure act of existing through itself, causing all else to exist. Do I really think, that you really have a zillion of these aliens looking at us? No, I don't really think that's the case. As a matter of fact, I think God would find that to be kind of a ludicrous scenario. But that's my view. Maybe God doesn't find it ludicrous, but it seems so anyway from the outside. So thank you for a good question, though.
Father Spitzer over here, to your left.
Sorry.
Hello. So your talk centered a lot on like science. So I'm kind of curious about your belief in like scientific theory of biological evolution and like how that relates to like what you're talking about. And then also, if we assume that there is a creator and that like that there indeed was a beginning, do you know of a way to logically link that creator to a specific like nature, like a specific way that that creator would be, or a specific religion that currently exists?
Okay, well, two good questions. The first part of that question, what about evolution? As for me, I certainly believe in it. And I believe that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, plus or minus 100 million years. I do believe that there's evolution of schemes of recurrence, both on the physical, chemical, and biological level that are occurring. I believe that the universe, that our Earth is 4.5 billion years old. I think that it has been in a state of evolution since that 4.5 billion years when it was created from our sun, when our sun came into being, literally. Because the sun and the Earth are almost coincident, just 100 million years off from each other. So, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's a very interesting kind of thought. Do I think that there's evolution within species? Yes, I do. Is there evolution outside of species? There have to be some evolution outside species, but they're very rare. How about evolution between non-living to living? Now it's getting harder because we have some problems. We have to put together a tremendous amount of complexity. And there are several very good agnostic philosophers right now that do not believe that this is explicable in the amount of time that we have. 4.5 billion years is not very much time. And maybe there are other planets which are older than our, not for the kind of complexity we're talking about. So, so a lot of, there's good articles, and I can give you a kind of a list. I didn't put any on your bibliographies tonight, but there are a lot of very good articles where, honestly, good agnostic people are saying, this is getting really hard to explain within the time limits of the universe. However, maybe it did happen, but we certainly don't have a disproof of it. So the key thought, though, is, let's suppose there's an evolutionary process that leads to our cerebral cortex. And, would that have any, be a problem for Catholics? And I don't know whether you're Catholic or not, but if you are Catholic, it's not a problem for you because in 1951, Pope Pius XII wrote an encyclical called Humani Generis. And basically he said, you can believe anything about evolution that you want that science has corroborated, so long as you do not say that the human being is reducible to a purely physical and biological mechanism. Every human being has a unique soul. Now, in light of the transphysical entities and those near-death experiences, I got to tell you, I don't have much of a problem with a transphysical soul right now. And I have to tell you, if that's the case, and that's the only stricture, your whole cerebral cortex could have evolved. Now, for purely rational reasons, I do think that that's going to be a very tough proposition to prove, purely naturalistically, because I think there are too many things, too much order that has to take place in order for that to occur, and 4.5 billion years is nothing. I mean, we're talking about trillion, the odds are, 10 to the 10 to the whatever. So, it's again pretty difficult to explain. What was your second question again? I'm just sorry. I spaced out on you. What was the second question?
It was that if we assume that there is indeed a beginning and a creator, like following the logical argument that you provided, is there also a way to logically link that creator to
a specific religion
that exists? Yeah. Or a specific nature of being good or evil or something?
Yeah, I would just say this. There are some religions currently that do contradict the scenario of, first of all, a unique one God, and there are certain religions that do seem to contradict the whole idea of the universe as we know it. However, Christianity is not one of them, Judaism is not one of them, and so forth. But there are some difficulties between religion and science on some levels, but I don't see Judeo-Christianity as being one of them. And frankly, Islam's probably not problematic on the whole. But science and reason can only go so far, right? At the end of the day, science can prove maybe an intelligent creator, transcendent creator. And philosophy, maybe like in a Lonerganian kind of a proof or a metaphysical proof can prove an uncaused cause has to be unrestricted, absolutely unique, and the continuous creator of all else that is. That's where reason can go. And then reason stops. Now, that's very nice, but does this creator, this intelligent creator, love you or not love you? Does he love you unconditionally or does he not love you unconditionally? Does he answer your prayers or does he not answer your prayers? Does he redeem your suffering or not redeem your suffering? Does he call you into a heavenly kingdom or just let you die? Does he inspire you? Does he guide you? You get the point. Every really meaningful and important question, unfortunately, is beyond reason. It's beyond the best that science and philosophy can offer. God is going to have to reveal himself to us. And yes, it's true that some religions' view of God is very commensurate with everything in these near-death experiences and everything we've been talking about cosmologically tonight. Judaism is, Christianity is, and more or less Islam is. That's true. However, if you want to say, well, which religion is right, that you're going to have to make a decision about from the heart. But if you really do believe that God is unconditional love, that's the consummate revelation of who God is, according to Jesus Christ. If you really believe that, if you really believe that the unconditionally loving God would be like the father in that prodigal son story, or would allow himself as an all-powerful creator to be called Daddy, Abba, if you really believe that the highest commandment would be love, among all the commandments and virtues, that it would be Shema Yisrael Elohim Eloheinu, the Lord your God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your strength, mind, soul, and heart, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and that all the law and the prophets are completely summarized in this, you might want to become a Christian. If, on the other hand, you think to yourself, well, God couldn't be unconditional love, because I don't have an answer to the question about suffering, and I don't have an answer to the question about exorcisms of children, and so forth. Maybe God's not unconditional love. You might think about something else. But just remember, there is that thought. I was once, doing a retreat I taught at Georgetown University for a long time before I became president of Gonzaga University. And when I was there, I used to have retreats. And one time a kid who was a physics major came on retreat. And let's call this guy Steve. And he comes up to me and he goes, I really don't have any problem with a causative force outside of space-time asymmetry. I mean, if general relativistic considerations proceed back to a singularity, then I really believe in a causative force outside of space-time asymmetry. That means he just believed in the Creator. And so I said, so Steve, what's your problem? And he said, well, it's the Jesus thing. I don't get it. So I said, well, Steve, let me ask you 6 questions. Question number 1. What's your most positive, most important, your most powerful force, capacity, power that you have? The one that can never go wrong. It'll always wind up at the most positive result and never with a negative or evil result. He said, well, I know it can't be my intellect. I could use that for evil. I said, good. I know it couldn't be my creativity. Good. Keep going. Is it love? I said, yeah, I think that might be right. Now, if love is your highest, most positive power, do you think that the Creator that you just admitted to as a result of a singularity theorem, do you think that the Creator that created the whole universe, and you included, could be devoid of love if you yourself recognize love as your most powerful and positive force? He goes, yeah, probably not. So, okay, well, let me ask you another question. Is the only thing you want some love? Or do you really want unconditional love? Because I got the answer to this question. I've never wanted unconditional love. I've never expected that in my whole life. I said, good. So you never broke up with a girlfriend because she just wasn't understanding enough. She wasn't responsive enough. She just wasn't home enough for you. And then she got really finite, and she got tired and stressed, and she said things she didn't mean, and you just finally got fed up with her and said, she's not the one, and broke up with her. He goes, yeah, I did that the other day. I said, well, what